Hello everyone, and welcome to Shedding of the Ego, a place where we confront the darkest and deepest desires of the human condition, and instead of turning away in disgust, we decide to meet its gaze. Today we're going to be discussing a form of human behavior, a phenomenon known as hybristophilia, and that is an attraction to extreme cases or people who have committed acts of violence. What is it, particularly in this podcast, we're going to be addressing the female of the human species. What is it that attracts women to extremely violent and dangerous psychopathic men, such as Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, various other spree killers, the Columbine shooters, Elliot Rodgers? The list goes on and on. What causes this curious phenomenon of young, fertile, nubile women camping out in the courtrooms of serial killers so that they can steal away a glance and hopefully, even for a moment, become the affection of a psychopath? Stay tuned, gentlemen. Today, we're going to be discussing hybristophilia, a term I think most encapsulates the female penchant for the quote-unquote bad boy. First, we're going to tackle the definition of the term according to a medical dictionary online. Hybristophilia is defined as a paraphilia in which a person is sexual-erotically attracted to a person who has committed an outrage or a gruesome crime. Maybe I think it's better to start with some examples found in popular culture and work our way up to real-world examples here. And of course, these are fictional examples, so I do not put 100% stock in them. I'm using this to create the suggestion that's going to bolster the real-world examples that I give you later on. Now, many cite the dynamic duo of the DC Comics universe, the Joker and his equally psychopathic female companion, Harley Quinn, of being a clear-cut example of the, quote, Florence Nightingale effect, in reference to the dedication that Florence Nightingale, who many consider to be the founder of modern nursing, demonstrated to her patients. It's described as follows. The Florence Nightingale effect is a situation where a caregiver develops romantic and or sexual feelings for his or her patient. Even if very little communication or contact takes place outside of the basic care, feelings may fade once the patient is no longer in need of care, either by recovery or death. And I believe this is a misdiagnosis of the famous character Harley Quinn, or at least only a partial diagnosis. Now, if you're versed on the origins of the Joker's main squeeze, you'll know that Quinn started as an Arkham Asylum psychiatrist named Dr. Harleen Frances Quinzel, who was tasked during her internship with psychoanalysis of some of Gotham's worst and most psychopathic criminals, one of which was the Joker himself. Now, during the process of interviewing the Joker, Quinn became mesmerized by his charisma, a trait that psychopaths often cultivate to hide their true natures. So, swayed by the Joker's force of personality and charm, Quinn then fell deeply in love with the Joker, culminating in her helping him escape, thus unleashing one of the most dangerous psychopaths in the DC Comics universe back into the streets in the process, and she eventually quit her comfortable life as a psychiatrist and joined him in his crime spree, taking on the now famous or infamous persona of Harley Quinn as we know her today. And I'll play just a quick little video clip of how she fell in love. You can all see this at sheddingoftheego.com on the original article.
It soon became clear to me that the Joker, so often described as a raving, homicidal madman, was actually a tortured soul crying out for love and acceptance. A lost, injured child trying to make the world laugh at his antics. And there, as always, was the self-righteous Batman, determined to make life miserable for my angel.
So, A bit of an exaggeration, sure, but we've seen this time and time again where women really seek to excuse violent male behavior as long as they're romantically attracted to it. I think Harley Quinn suffered not only from this, Florence Nightingale effect, taking pity and then eventually attraction on a man that is incapacitated somehow or hurting somehow or injured somehow. In this case, it was the Joker's imprisonment that made her take pity. But I think she suffered also from an advanced case of hybristophilia. Furthermore, I will speculate here that hybristophilia is an as of yet poorly understood condition that seems to be categorized into very simplistic classification of women who are either hybristophiliacs or women that are not hybristophiliacs with nothing residing in between. Now, if you think back to our ancient existence, when human beings were leading prehistoric, short, and oftentimes violent lives, the creature comforts of our modern, technologically advanced civilization simply did not exist. Mr. Caveman, who wanted to have reproductive access to the female sex, had to have something to offer in return. He had to assure the females he wanted to mate with that he would provide them with regular access to shelter and sustenance. He had to be violent enough to kill enough game so as to feed himself, his women, and the children he produced with them. He also had to have an innate capacity to kill other men that may want to move in on the resource-rich tract of land he controlled, or the women he had sexual access to. So to put it bluntly, and we've all discussed this, we've all heard this before, violent men have been selected by women for reproduction since time immemorial, and despite the fact that we have, through a manipulation of evolutionary drives, built a civilization that alleviates this burden of violence to a large degree, a great many women still residually crave violent men. Now, your average woman, of course, has no desire to date a violent psychopath, at least not one on the order of serial killers like Ted Bundy or Richard Ramirez, which were known for viciously, violently murdering and raping women, and in Ted Bundy's case, much, much worse, up to and including acts of necrophilia. But, your average woman does want a little bit of that violent caveman to trickle through the civilized exterior of the men she is attracted to on occasion. And I've explored this topic somewhat in a video I uploaded a few years ago, which is going to be in the description. And that's titled Female Rape Fantasy is Not What It Seems. So you can check that out as well. But essentially, women seek to ensure their safety and provision within society via a sort of double whammy attack pattern. Simply extracting male provision via taxpayer subsidy is not enough, and simply having a husband who is willing to pay and provide for her is just simply not enough. Oftentimes, women will seek a third means of provision and, in this case, protection. The obsession with protection and provision that we see from the female expresses itself on the macro scale via the pursuance of sometimes downright fascistic laws surrounding violence against women, such as rape shield and primary aggressor domestic violence laws, etc. And these laws are oftentimes wholly inconsiderate of concepts of equality like due process and the hard-won luxury of a legal system that presumes innocence before guilt is established. So, to the collective unconscious, the Borg hive mind that drives the enfranchised female masses, due process really is irrelevant. They are voting with their hindbrain, and thus they vote to ensure that their most primitive needs and desires are addressed and then satiated. The problem is, though, that it can never be satiated. It's an unconscious drive that is always there, and it doesn't end. This drive beckons and demands more safety and provision forever. Thus, while female enfranchisement leverages the electoral process in their favor, and then after this legal system implements as much gynocentrism as it can bear without collapsing, the individual female also has been simultaneously cultivating her individual instinct for her own protection and provision in the form of what we in the MGTOW world have coined as the alpha male brute. And that is, as we've discussed, an individual who was prone to violence and physically imposing enough to deal a lot of damage with that violence, who is oftentimes not intelligent enough to understand that he is in a servile position to the female he is involved with, existing as a hired thug who is paid in sexual access. It's kind of a pincer attack, a social pincer attack designed to maximize benefit for the female collective. And frankly, men's rights or health or lives never factor into this process in any meaningful way. It's just purely and potently gynocentric and in many cases subconscious. Take as an example the following video preceded by a quick synopsis. So, woman walks into a fast food joint and cuts in line. Man responds by telling a person he is having a conversation with on the phone that the woman did in fact cut in line. The woman overhears this and immediately gets in his face, being rude and argumentative and ultimately violent. Eventually, her 300-pound ex-convict boyfriend joins the conversation, at which point a brief confrontation between the man and her boyfriend ensues. Out of nowhere, the ex-con boyfriend sucker punches the man, beating him viciously. So then, what did we witness here besides a vicious attack? Well, let's start from the perspective of the woman. Let's assume, hypothetically, that this woman might have started this conversation without her boyfriend there to protect her. Let's assume that the man attacked her in self-defense after she initiated the violence. Now, this woman would likely have no problem relying on the first line of gynocentric protection available to her. That is, the macro-scale level protection of a police force or a passing white knight who would leap to her defense without even questioning who initiated the violence. And this is why women advocate for things like primary aggressor laws that almost universally assume guilt on the part of the man in domestic violence disputes, despite evidence to the contrary if it exists. So again, women want this to be the case. They are not concerned with due process and equal rights for men. They are concerned with leveraging the state and having it bolster their primordial reproductive habits. Now, in this case, however, the boyfriend was around, who was by all accounts the alpha male brute that we describe in the MGTOW community. He is prone to violence, physically imposing, and almost seems to take pleasure in subjecting another man to the brutality he can unleash on behalf of his female master. It's an extreme example of what all women desire on some level: communal protections from non-violent men in the form of a legal system, and individual protections from violent men in the form of these alpha male brutes that are more than willing to disregard those legal protections. And I think this is what drives the female tendency to hybristophilia, which only seems to be pathologized in the most extreme examples, but which actually lies instead on a continuum. It is a spectrum of hybristophilia, ranging from the woman who prefers a spanking by her man in the bedroom, all the way up to and including serial killer groupies that gain notoriety for swooning at hyper-violent serial killers such as Ted Bundy and Richard Ramirez during the fanfare of their trials. So every woman who has ever asked you to choke her or spank her or smack her ass or spit on her in a safe and controlled setting during consensual sex is acting out this misunderstood urge. She is looking to you to unleash your inner caveman. She is asking you to become a violent weapon that she can wield for her protection, and in doing this, she oftentimes, actually receives immense sexual stimulation. I do not hate women for this. As a matter of fact, the first time I kind of made this link, I'll tell you a brief story. I was walking on a hiking trail with an ex-girlfriend of mine. We had, of course, as couples do, a lot of conversations about sexuality and, what turns her on and what turns me on, etc. And so we've discussed things, and, in these discussions, it came out that fear was something that, got her wet. I mean, for lack of a better word, it made her vagina lubricate itself. I kind of took that in passing, and I was like, okay, well, that's cool, whatever. And but I didn't really understand, I didn't really internalize it. And I didn't internalize it till that day that we were walking on the trail. Now, this was a private trail. And while we were hiking on this trail, one of these critters came and kind of ran up her leg. And these things, I don't remember what they are or what they're called, but they're all over upstate New York. They are, they have these kind of hairy, hair-like, cilia-like legs. And they're very fast and they're very ugly. And she was absolutely terrified of insects, right? So, one of those things crawled up her legs, and I smacked it off or whatever, and she was just absolutely terrified of this little critter. After that, we resumed our walk or whatever, and she was telling me, how that experience, made her wet. It was an involuntary reaction, and I didn't believe her. So, I went and checked. I actually checked her down there, and I was like, wow, fear really gets you off, I guess, right? So I do not hate women for this. In many respects, this is an involuntary reaction. I don't hate them for it. I don't expect them to change this. I believe it to be an innate quality of female sexual attraction. I do not excuse them either if they act on these urges in a way that causes real instead of simulated violence against other human beings, like the women depicted in the video I just showed you. The women that are so beholden to their primitive drives that they take to wielding one of these brutes via proxy violence to harm others should be locked up and kept away from civilized people. But in terms of the urge, right? The female attraction to violent men, I suspect that there is very little we can do to counteract this. The fictional universe of Gattaca addressed this via filtering out the genetic markers for violence they had discovered, and I suspect that the only way that we will ever change this quirk of female sexual attraction would be through something along those lines, some kind of genetic engineering. And of course, that would necessitate a highly unethical eugenics campaign, the likes of which I soundly reject and would never take part in. Unless, of course, it was all voluntary, but the likelihood of that is slim to none. So given this, it seems we are left with containment of the beast, as it were. We will have to understand the female proclivity towards selecting violent men, and we will have to manage it and discourage it to the best of our ability. And so I begin our efforts here with simple documentation. First, we start with Anders Behring Breivik, the cultural Marxist conspiracy theorist who slaughtered 77 souls, most of which were young adolescents. An article titled, Norway's Mass Murderer Anders Behring Breivik Gets Hundreds of Love Letters a Year, states the following. She calls him by his first name, sends him letters every week, and promises to wait for him. It could be any love story, but Victoria's heart belongs to a mass murderer, Anders Behring Breivik, responsible for Norway's worst peacetime killings since World War II. Breivik, like many other notorious killers, has his share of admirers, a phenomenon that can be accompanied by sexual attraction and in which case even has a term, hybristophilia. I really wouldn't want to live without him, says Victoria, who does not want her real name published. A young Swedish woman in her 20s, she comes off as distant and standoffish, ignoring her fresh cup of coffee in a Stockholm hotel lobby, but her voice cracks when she talks about her, quote, dearest Anders. From a small town in Sweden, she is doing everything she can to obtain an easing of Breivik's prison conditions. He has spent the past 4 years in isolation at a high-security penitentiary. He is currently serving a 21-year sentence, which can be extended if he is still considered a danger to society. Breivik killed 77 people on July 22, 2011, when he set off a bomb near the government offices in Oslo, and then opened fire on a labor youth summer camp in the island of Utøya. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies for not. For Victoria, Breivik's isolation amounts to, quote, torture. She says, I care even more about him now that he is in such a vulnerable situation, and we're seeing that Nightingale effect starting to come in there. Unemployed because of health issues, she writes to him to help boost his morale. So far, more than 150 letters, or sends him small gifts, including a dark blue tie he occasionally wore during his trial. In return, she has received 2 letters from him, which she showed to the AFP, the others having been blocked by prison officials tasked with censoring his mail. Onto the subject of marriage proposals, it says it's not easy to define her relationship with Breivik, a man she has never met since all of her requests to visit him have been denied. She describes him as both her older friend and protective brother figure, but admits that she finds him attractive and there were romantic interests at first, at least from my part. End quote. She says that their first contact dates back to 2007 when they met through an online game. He cut off ties with her 2 years later, most likely to concentrate on planning his attacks. But in early 2012, Victoria reconnected with the man who by then had become the most hated person in Norway, and she is not alone. The weekly Morgenbladet, again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, reported last year that Breivik receives at least 800 letters a year, many of them from female admirers. During his 2012 trial, it emerged that a 16-year-old girl had asked him to marry her. Hybristophilia is a term used by criminologists, but not scientists, to describe a sexual attraction to violent killers in prison, who often receive racy love letters or sexy undergarments from their fans. Also known as the, quote, Bonnie and Clyde syndrome, it has existed throughout time and across borders. Joseph Fritzl of Australia, who held his daughter captive and raped her repeatedly for 25 years, and American killer Charles Manson also have their own fan clubs, often abused women. According to Sheila Eisenberg, an American author who interviewed 30 women for her book, Women Who Love Men Who Kill, these admirers often have a history of sexual abuse. Quote, it's a chance for women to be in control. The man is behind bars for life and has no control over anything. When previously she had been abused by her father or other men, she explained to AFP. Also, it is romance with a capital R, exciting, thrilling, a never-ending roller coaster. Nothing humdrum or ordinary about these relationships. There is, however, no scientific evidence to support the widespread belief that these women felt they are on a mission to help the killer get on the right track in life, said Amanda Vickery, an assistant professor of psychology at Wesleyan University in the United States. Some women tend to be drawn to famous men. It's possible that the reason for some women's attraction to men who have done horrible things is not so much what they've done, but the fame they have received from their acts, she said. Victoria, meanwhile, says she is not a fame seeker. Her involvement with Breivik has already cost her her relationship with her sister, who, upon learning of her ties to him, told her, "You're dead to me." As she has distanced herself from her friends, she admits to more or less sharing Breivik's Islamophobic ideology, but says she is opposed to violence. So how can she love a man who coldly gunned down dozens of terrified teenagers, some of whom begged him to spare their lives? She says, quote, "I guess I had to separate Anders from Breivik, really. I think of Anders as my old friend and Breivik as the person who did all of those things. The years go by, and yet she refuses to give up on him. I miss him more and more every day. I guess my feelings have gotten a bit stronger," end quote. And another interesting article that I stumbled upon will really give you a bit of insight into the nature of this phenomenon. It's titled Editorial on Love, Sex, and Murderers. And this is a very long article, so I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me. And this is why I'm splitting this video up into two different parts. But the article says, quote, "Serial killers are interesting. We are at once fascinated and repulsed by the study of sociopaths out for blood, and most often, men out for the blood of women. The idea of the good serial killer a la Dexter is a relatively new one, but it's a long-known fact that women flooded Ted Bundy with love letters. A woman married Richard Ramirez while he was in jail, and there are countless other examples of lesser-known criminals and their groupies. We ask why serial killers do what they do all the time. Perhaps this is where the fascination starts for people who identify as Hybristophiliacs. A few years ago, I encountered a girl who was around 16 that self-identified as a Ted head, a Ted Bundy groupie. It was easy to dismiss as the romanticization of a man whose horror she had never experienced. Her other interests were, like many of mine, dark and subversive. My thinking at the time was that someday she would grow up and realize that finding a person interesting is not the same as finding them emotionally or sexually attractive. After all, Bundy used the fact that he was a handsome man to kill women. He's not exactly the kind of guy you would want to date. You wouldn't want to date Rodney James Alcala either, but he famously won the quote-unquote dating game, and he's referring to the serial killer who was found with hundreds of, I believe as of yet unidentified pictures of random women, and a couple of women that he actually murdered. Very disturbing stuff, but this gentleman went on a dating game and really charmed his way to, winning. It was one of those kind of bachelor dating games where a woman sits behind a wall where she can't see the contestants, and she asks them questions, and from the answers to those questions, she decides, who she wants to select for a blind date. And this man, this serial killer, very charismatic, very charming, was actually the one who won that date. But the author continues on. He said, "I wanted to write a bit about the Ted Bundy phenomenon and how it continues in a new generation. I started at a website titled Bundy File, hoping to start right at the source of my efforts to write about and gain some understanding of the young women embracing Bundy. One Facebook page referred to him as the misunderstood voice of a generation. The themes featured on these sites were repetitive. Bundy wasn't all that bad. Bundy was misunderstood. Yes, what Bundy did was wrong, but you can love and admire him without idolizing his crimes. Many of the women and girls obsessing over Bundy and other serial killers seem to think that they could be the person to change them, or to nurture them, or to be the, quote, one that was there for him and kept all the bad things from happening. In one blog entry, a woman calling herself, quote, Lolita, proclaims, in all caps of course, "Anyway, if my own death could fill the hollow soul of Ted Bundy, I would have really loved to be his last victim," end quote. She claimed they were similar. She claimed to understand him. He was, quote, different from other killers. Remember, Ted Bundy was likely dead before this woman was even born. A few minutes into my research, it became clear that one cannot look for Ted heads without finding Dahmer fangirls, and the obsession many internet fangirls have with gay male sex, specifically Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer engaged in gay sex. This was around the time my research took a sharp left turn. Up to this point, the women seemed emotionally invested and, yes, obsessed. They seemed to believe that the love of a woman like themselves could have saved the violent men they idolized. When I hit Miss Dahmer's Infinity Land, it became clear that there was much more to this phenomenon than the tendency of high school/college-age girls to fall for misunderstood or, quote, dark men. This was about sex. Okay, yeah, I guess we knew that, but it was about some seriously dark, disturbing sex based completely on how violent and terrible these men were. A Tumblr post reads, "Most girls, Have you seen his body, though? Me. Have you seen his body count, though? Miss Dahmer's page features several photos of Dahmer. Most mugshots are photos of him in prison jumpsuits. The photos are captioned lovingly, the way you might imagine a middle school girl might caption a photo of her favorite Disney heartthrob in her diary, but it devolves from there rather quickly. Once I discover the Hybristoerotica tag on Tumblr, things get decidedly dark, decidedly fast. A Tumblr dedication to the celebration of hybristophilia drags me deep into a corner of the internet I never expected to find. Sex and Crime All the Time features, among other things, photos of famous serial killers with sexually explicit confessions plastered over them, and a serial erotica story called Stockholm Syndrome focusing on Richard Ramirez, otherwise known as the Night Stalker. I want to take a moment to state that I understand that rape fantasy is not the same as wanting to be raped, and that plenty of women with healthy sex lives are into rough play. However, I think this fantasy becomes a little different when the fantasies are focused on men known to prey on women violently. I also wonder about the line in the sand as these women proudly identify as Hybristophiliacs and defend the legitimacy of this attraction, though the profile of women who fit the definition isn't a list of positive personality traits, and many of them admit to sexual dysfunction outside of situations where they are fantasizing about killers. The hardcore Hybristophiliacs don't often bother with claiming the men they are obsessed over are, quote, misunderstood or, quote, only part bad. When an anonymous fan of Tumblr asks if Ted Bundy loved his wife and child, the owner of the blog answers, I don't think he did. There does seem to be limits, though. One anon says, sad, because Eric Harris's, this is the one part of the duo of shooters that carried out the Columbine high school shooting attacks. One anon says she's sad because Eric Harris's diary featured homophobic sentiment. The owner of the blog comforts her by assuming he would have outgrown those sentiments if he had lived. The, quote, line, however, doesn't have anything to do with the way men treated women. It seems the worse the offense, the more these women were drawn to them, the more violent the fantasy. And at this point in the article, there's an image, and I'm going to include that in the video, of a woman, and it's kind of blurred out, but you can see she's in high heels and all that. And it's a man, having sex with her. It's blurred out again, so, I'm hoping YouTube doesn't, ban this or whatever. But it says, in pink letters, when I masturbate to Ted Bundy choking and raping me, I always end up having a long and hard orgasm. For some reason, I find the obsession with men like Bundy and Ramirez less disturbing than the sexual and romantic fantasies associated with more recent killers. There is a good chance that women idolizing Bundy, wearing his face on pendants and staring at his picture, weren't alive when Bundy died in 1989. He can be a, quote, character like Loki from the Avengers, or yes, even Dexter. No one they know has had contact with him, and they didn't feel the horror he caused personally. But the women fantasizing about Elliot Rodger were most definitely alive when he opened fire in Santa Barbara in May of this year. Their obsession goes deeper than his looks. These women have studied his hateful videos and so-called manifesto. His vitriol toward women does nothing to push the Hybristophiliacs away. In fact, it seems to do the opposite. All the women drawn to Rodger have a common desire, to be his first girlfriend. And so, again, this Nightingale theme keeps popping up, but I really want you to notice how it's this recurring theme to cure violent men, and I think that's just a subconscious desire to wield violent men. Women love reformed bad boys. They love to be the rescuer. They love to be the helper, but they also want that helper to be able to protect them in return. So the article continues and says, to be the girl that calms the anger in him. Some fantasize about Rodger with Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris of the Columbine shooting, positing that they could show him how to get women. Hybristoerotica features 2 erotic fan fiction pieces on Elliot Rodger, one written from his point of view and another told from a woman's point of view. In Come Over and Fuck Me, that's the title, she imagines herself as his lifelong friend, unaware of his lust for her. The erotica isn't well written, but that's not the point. It doesn't have to be. The very thought of fucking these dangerous men is what entraps the women participating on the Hybristophilia tags on Tumblr. The serial killer fandom and Hybristophiliacs receive a lot of negative attention from other Tumblr users, particularly those who enjoy true crime but do not want to associate with people they feel fetishize and idolize murderers. If you go through any of the popular Hybristophilia tags, you will see defenses of Hybristophilia again and again. They insist they are not mocking the victims or supporting the crime. They respect the victims. They just also find themselves attracted to the murderer. The most interesting case is the group of young women obsessed with high school shooter TJ Lane. While his fans insist they respect the victims and the families of the victims, they also praise him for wearing shirts that say, quote, killer on them in court and pass around gifs of him saying to the parents of his victims, quote, the hand that pulled the trigger to kill your sons now masturbates to the memory, fuck all of you, while flipping them off. They brand this as, quote, sass and tag photos of him with, quote, the king of sass, unquote. Almost all memes, GIFs, and collages of TJ Lane involve the quote in whole or in part. They love him in large part because he was disrespectful to the families of his victims. It seems the worse offense, the more these women are drawn to them, the more violent the fantasy. Some hybristophiliacs claim that they are completely normal, one even citing her therapist in defense of her obsession with TJ Lane. Others claim it is no different from any other paraphilia, a condition in which a person's sexual arousal and gratification depend on fantasizing about and engaging in sexual behavior that is atypical and extreme, and as such should be respected. It is worth noting that pedophilia is the most common type of paraphilia, and no one is suggesting we support pedophiles as normal, not even the hybristophiliacs that are into men who have abused children. The four most common types of paraphilia involve a dismissal of consent: pedophilia, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and fraudorism, the act of rubbing oneself on non-consenting persons. Another fact worth considering in respecting hybristophiliacs as, quote, normal is that paraphilia often leads to sexual dysfunction, needing the thing they are attracted to for sexual gratification. If hybristophilia makes women who love serial killers unable to have healthy sex lives with men who don't want to rape or kill them, I would dare say it isn't normal. These observations aren't meant as judgment on the hybristophilia communities per se, but to be fair to them also means showing the side that doesn't support their claims of normalcy. So, why do women want sociopaths? Why is a half-decent face and a high body count a draw for them? Even Timothy McVeigh had entries under hybristophilia tags. There seems to be no limit. Some are purely sexual, some are borderline romantic, and some are downright disturbing given the men they are discussing. Here are a couple from the Jahar Sarnev tag, and this is, of course, the Boston Bombers we're talking about here. And, it's a woman bent over showing herself in a thong, and again, pardon the explicit language, but again, we're all adults, so I expect you to be able to handle that. I don't know how to pronounce this gentleman's name. Let's just call him Brother Sarnev. It starts with a D. I want Sarnev to fuck me in my ass. I've never done it in the ass, but I would for him in a heartbeat. The thought turns me on so much, I need his cock in my ass now. So, pretty explicit stuff. The deeper I get into hybristophilia tags and websites, the less sense it seemed to make. Going into this, I admit, I figured I would find a few groups of misfits that were still into Ted Bundy and Richard Ramirez. Like many, I read the articles that came out showing that the Sarnevs, James Holmes, and Adam Lanza had attracted a female following, but most of the quoted content seemed to be, oh, he's hot, which can be an objective opinion, although most people have a harder time separating a person's attractiveness from their actions. The longing claims of love, unending support, and hero worship definitely shook me. When I hit the graphic sex, I felt like I was spitting out. My brain can't really make sense of it, especially in cases like that of TJ Lane, who is not only remorseless, but took such glee in rubbing his crimes in the faces of the families of those he killed. I have always viewed Halloween, horror movies, and books, and a fascination of the dark and disturbing, a healthy reaction to a terrifying world. People study serial killers because we know that though they behave like monsters, they are human. By learning about them, we gain knowledge that helps us feel proactive and therefore safe. When we get into horror and the supernatural, it's a terror we can control. It's a skull made of paper mache you can hold in your hand and know it's not so bad. What's disturbing about the hybristophiliacs on the internet, what is so unsettling, is that they've crossed the line somehow. They've gone beyond a desire to understand, beyond a fascination, and right into an uncontrolled obsession. That will conclude part one of this exploration into the female attraction to violence. Thank you for listening, gentlemen. The second installment will be coming soon.